everyone, and welcome to Automation Alley's virtual tech takeover hosted by Comcast Business. My name is Allison Trumbull, and I am Automation Alley's relationship manager. We here at Automation Alley are Michigan's Industry 4.0 Knowledge Center and a World Economic Forum Advanced Manufacturing Hub, or AmHub. We obsess over disruptive technologies like blockchain, 3D printing, and AI. Our goal is to take these big complex concepts and make them a little bit easier for companies and individuals to understand and really implement today. So we work with a wide range of companies, from those that are really grasping the concept of digitization to thought leaders and innovators in Industry 4.0, as we'll hear today. So we do this by hosting a plethora of events and obtaining content from every aspect of industry and academia to give businesses a competitive advantage and help them along their digital transformation journey. So speaking of events, I do have a little bit of updated news. Our Integrate or Industry 4.0 conference that we have originally was going to be in October. We have changed the date to May 10th, 2022. So thank you everybody for your consideration and patience. We want this to be the best conference as possible and have all of the information and Industry 4.0 knowledge. So it will still be in person, May 10th, 2022. If you have any questions about sponsorships, tickets, participation, attending, please reach out to me. And please remember, every manufacturer in Michigan does get one free ticket to attend. But now on to our presenting company. Comcast Business probably needs little introduction. They're one of the nation's leading providers of communications, entertainment, and cable products and services. They employ over 100,000 employees nationwide with the goal of delivering the highest level of service and improving the customer experience. Today, we're going to be diving into best practices to assess and manage your organization's capacity to monitor, detect, and respond to the latest cybersecurity threats. We'll hear how attackers are leveraging digital transformation to exploit changes to the network perimeter, applications, and third-party risks. Today, I'm going to be joined by Ivan Shefrin, Executive Director, Managed Security Services at Comcast Business. Ivan has hands-on cybersecurity leadership with 25 years of experience partnering with enterprise and communication service providers to anticipate and capitalize on disruptive technology trends, transform IT architectures, and generate new forms of value from the convergence of cloud and network security, data analytics, and automated threat response. We'll also be joined by Eric Malauer, CEO and General Manager of Blue Vector. Eric was founder and Chief Executive Officer for DeepMile Networks. Eric joined Comcast in 2017 and works in strategic development, cybersecurity growth and innovation, as well as AI and data strategy. So thank you everybody for being here this morning. I do want to remind you that we will be doing Q&A throughout the whole presentation. So if you have any questions at any time, please use that small Q&A box at the bottom, type in your questions, and I'll be popping in live to kind of moderate and respond to those. So please ask them and we'll make sure to have just a great conversation around cybersecurity. And with that, like I said, thank you for being here today. And Ivan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Allison. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining bright and early. I think we were going to start with a short video, actually. So I'm not sure who's responsible for kicking that off, but if we can give that a start, that would be great. Anybody? I can go right into it if you'd prefer. I think our tech people are scrambling. I'm just going to go right into the presentation then. The video basically tells us what most of us here already know, is that cybersecurity is a big issue and the number of attacks have increased dramatically in recent years. And I'll go right into the deck. The topic of today is risk and resilience. So everybody's got some form of cybersecurity protection in place now. And by the way, just as a brief introduction, I'm going to give you about a 30-minute presentation on some practical advice that every organization can take, whether you're large or small, about how to mitigate and reduce the risk, particularly focusing on ransomware. And then Eric Malware is going to come in. And Eric is really a genius in this industry, at least from my personal opinion, and is on the cutting edge with things like malware detection and using behavioral analytics and machine learning to do that. So he's got a really unique and cool perspective on all of this. Yeah.
I have the video if you'd like for me to go ahead and share.
Sure, go ahead. Go ahead. I'll stop. I'll stop sharing if I can find my share button. Go ahead and run it.
Okay.
T-Mobile is being slapped with a pair of lawsuits following a major cyber attack. One of the suits accuses the company of putting plaintiffs at considerable risk due to its failure to protect customer information.
The city of Gary, Indiana is working to recover from a ransomware attack that targeted several of its servers.
Government does not actually own and operate all or even most of our critical infrastructure. And what that means is we're only as strong as our weakest links.
The city of Tulsa will have crews working through the weekend trying to repair problems from last week's ransomware attack.
Drivers across the Southeast continuing to hunt for gasoline following a cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline.
Well, Colonial Pipeline, it's back up and running, everyone, after the company paid $5 million to Russian hackers. We've seen a recent series of high-profile cybersecurity breaches and attacks against the federal government and critical infrastructure. And we don't expect that these threats are going to diminish.
Thanks, Jocelyn. I'm going to share my deck now. And here you go. Don't think I was even doing that before. So that's a whole nother problem. I get asked these questions all the day. A big part of my job is talking to people in the industry and talking to Comcast customers who have cybersecurity issues and needs. And a lot of these are small businesses and mid-sized businesses and small enterprises. So really, our customer base ranges very widely, including a large segment of in the manufacturing, but it's across all segments: healthcare, legal, financial services, banking, you name it. And the common questions people are asking these days are like, how do I prevent ransomware? How do I make sure I don't lose my business operations, business continuity gets maintained? How do I do that with, just 1, 2, or 3 people on my staff, even if not 10? Most companies can't afford the best practices that are required to protect against ransomware. And it's difficult to know really what's going on in the business. Even for large enterprises, we have to work very hard at it. And it's not just technology, it's people and process. People and process are probably 80% of what you need to focus on, but technology is also really critical. So why is this all so complex? Let me go to the next slide. If Teams, where we're at. So it's really complex. There are hundreds and hundreds of vendors. It's a $60 or $70 billion industry worldwide. About half of that's in North America, by the way. And everybody kind of tends to sound the same. When you break cybersecurity down to a business message, basically you're buying insurance, right? You're either buying insurance, you're buying cybersecurity products and services because a regulator told you needed to do that from a compliance point of view, or your auditor told you. Or in some cases, you really do want to protect yourself and achieve a best practice and greater maturity. But at the end of the day, unless you really dig down under the covers of these technologies, it's very difficult to tell the difference and how effective they are. So what I always tell people to do is start by focusing on the biggest problems. And if you look at this survey that Cisco did about a year ago across all different sized businesses, it's pretty clear that in today's environment, ransomware is by far the greatest problem, right? It's in terms of causing outages, causing system downtime, interrupting business continuity. And according to Gartner and also FBI statistics, last year saw a huge increase. It really doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that. You can just open the paper any day and read about some new attack. And really kind of scary here is that 3 out of 4 organizations are predicted in the next few years to be a victim of an attack of ransomware themselves. But the good news, there is a good news and a bright lining to this cloud, which is that attackers are opportunistic. So if you take some steps to protect yourself and you start increasing the maturity of how you practice and implement cybersecurity controls, you can make it so difficult for them that they'll move on to an easier target. And that's kind of the topic of what I'm going to talk about in detail today. So when we look at this, especially if you're reading press articles and so forth, the term security incident or security event and security breach get used almost interchangeably. But for those of us in the industry, they're very different things. Security events, there are, in a company the size of Comcast, even, we've got tens of thousands of these every day. I mean, they just come all the time. But just because a security event happens doesn't mean we're actually at risk or that we've lost data. A security breach or a data breach, those are much more serious types of events where somebody's not, a whole series of security incidents have happened or security events that lead to the loss or destruction of data. And that's really what we all need to be focused on, not the incident. The good news is that this really gives us an opportunity to detect and disrupt and contain security events before they result in a loss of data. If you look on the right side, a couple of statistics here, obviously ransomware has grown in terms of its focus. And the reason, as I said before, is opportunistic. It's just a much easier way to make money for organized criminals and who want to disrupt and get money than it is to steal data and try and sell it on the open market. And most of those are, brute force attacks, vulnerabilities. It's split pretty evenly between phishing and brute force is basically kind of a volumetric attempt to try and break in using random credentials or credentials that you think might be might work to compromise an account. So with that opportunity to detect and disrupt and contain, what do we have to do? The first way to look at this is there's this thing called the kill chain. And I'm not going to go into all the details of this here and drain the slide, but this is invented years ago by Lockheed Martin. And there's a progression as an attacker or a criminal tries to break into your environment. First they'll look around and see what ports and protocols are open, what user identities and what they can harvest from the public web, and just kind of research your organization. And it's really pretty surprising what you can learn just from publicly available information, social networking links, and so forth. And then they'll try and get in through the front door or potentially through the back door in a kind of supply chain attack, which we've seen obviously was SolarWinds recently. But supply chain dates back for years. If you remember 5 or 6 years ago, Target was breached, and that was an HVAC vendor. That was their heating and air conditioning vendor who had to have access to monitor their systems. And then they deliver that and exploit it and install it. It's really all these are mostly security events and incidents. They're not data breach items up until you get to that last stage, which is actions on objectives. And that's where things get gnarly, as I say, and people are inside, they're landed. They're often hidden. It could take days, weeks, or months before they figure out how they want to penetrate and steal data or create a ransomware event. And that's what ultimately we want to prevent is, and the fact that this kill chain takes a long time, and hackers are often go low and slow, gives us opportunities to detect and disrupt them early on. So I'm just going to switch actually. I'm not going to drain this slide. I'm not even really going to talk about it other than to say, when you're looking at the kill chain, there are hundreds and hundreds of different types of attack vectors throughout this, throughout the kill chain. And they break down into some very technical details. I don't think I'm sharing my whole screen, so I can't show you the, well, let me try. Just go to the desktop. Hopefully you can still see my screen. Kick me under the table if you can't, but oops. Here's the kill chain. And if you look at some of these sub techniques, it gets, you know, really detailed, spear phishing. And again, these are both opportunities and threats because they give us a way to create profiles and patterns, which is really where Eric kind of kicks in. Eric, do you want to have any comment here on the profiles and patterns and identifying that, or is it too early for you to kick in? I don't think I probably caught him by surprise and he wasn't ready, so I'll just keep going. So how do we protect ourselves against this? What are the best practices in the industry for defending it against that kill chain and disrupting attacks before they result in lost or stolen data? So the typical model is called defense in depth, which is layered defense, right? If you think about the old castle metaphor where you had, you cleared the land of trees so you could see your attackers coming in. You'd have a moat, you'd have spikes, you'd have a high wall, and then you'd have different perimeters going all the way back to the castle keep. Well, it's somewhat of an outdated metaphor these days because we don't live in a world where everything is in the same physical environment. Cloud transformation has dramatically shifted our world where you could have applications living in the cloud, data living on-prem, users all over the place, including work from home, work from mobile devices, bring your own devices. And so in many ways, the perimeter is dead. But the concept of defense in depth is still valid across networks, hosts, which are both endpoint workstations and servers, applications, data, and so forth. And so you need a layered method in case one security control fails. There are others to back it up and essentially make it much more difficult for an attacker to get in and exploit the weaknesses they may find. Residual risk in cybersecurity it's a common concept across all types of risk management. But basically, it's after you put in all your endpoint and network and security controls, as well as your processes and your people, what is the remaining risk? Even the largest organizations in the world, there is always risk. And when you look at something like Colonial Pipeline, which at face value seems like a large corporation with, very good security. At the end of the day, everybody's got risk. You can't eliminate risk, but you can make it so difficult that somebody's going to move on to an easier target. And that's our mission in cybersecurity as a business owner. If you're an IT generalist, if you're in compliance and risk, really, cybersecurity needs to go across the organization. Traditionally, we were kind of an insular culture in cyber. Some people called us Dr. No because you want to do that with your application. No, you can't do that. Now it's become very clear and that cybersecurity is everybody's job in a company, not just the team that understands the bits and bytes of how to do it.
Hey, Ivan, it's Eric.
Yeah.
I can assure you I had a lot of profound things to say, but my screen and mute button were frozen, so I apologize. Please continue.
That's all right. Feel free to kick in. Anything you want to add to this?
No, keep going. I'll jump in a minute.
All right. So I'm coming up to the part pretty soon where I'm going to go into some details about practical things that you can do in your organization. And these apply to, again, any size organization. If you, I'm just, going back up here, remember that basically the types of security problems are not all that different across different size organizations. It's just where the priorities are for different sizes, but everybody's basically got the same problem. And to protect and prevent and disrupt those cybersecurity problems, we've got to apply very similar types of controls and practices. Of course, I'll talk about this in a minute, but that's much more difficult for a mid-size or small business to do than for a large corporation. Different kinds of problems, but the same problem. So the NIST organization, National Institute for Standards and Technology, provides a ton of resources. If you want to read up on this quickly and understand kind of what I might be able to do in my business context, every business is different. Everybody's got a different level of risk for themselves. Everybody's got different, assets that they need to protect. And so the context for this changes from each organization to the next. But at the high level, NIST provides great resources to put in place a framework for growing your level of maturity as an organization to protect yourselves, right? So we talked about identifying events during that kill chain. We talked about defense in depth for protecting and detecting these. And we're going to talk a little bit about responding and recovering, right? So it's not enough to have, the latest antivirus or endpoint defense or the world's best firewall. And of course, not all of us have enough money for the world's best firewall, so we have to make do with less. And it's about being able to respond and recover and putting in place the policies and people responsible for helping you do that. So again, more difficult for the small and mid-sized business to do, and we'll talk about some strategies for how you might accomplish that in a minute. This is a continuous learning life cycle. That's the other thing I want to mention. As we move to the cloud, as we transform our businesses into new revenue lines of revenue or new mission statements, and we enable new types of technology to do that, such as mobile, such as cloud, such as machine learning and so forth, robotic process automation, commonly used in chatbots, for example, to improve the customer service experience and build long-lasting relationships. All that, just like agile and agile practices have led to continuous improvement, continuous integration and deployment from a DevOps perspective. The same is true for cybersecurity. And just as the attackers continually develop new ways of exploiting our vulnerabilities, risks, and weaknesses, we have to stay agile. And so this is not a one-time thing or something that you do once a year because an auditor or a customer asked you to do it. It's really, really important that you get disciplined about doing this on an ongoing basis. And it starts at the top of the company. It's not, it's bottom up and top down. You need to get your board of directors and leadership involved, as well as the people actually doing the work in the trenches, which is where most of us have all started. So let's go to some practical measures for how to manage risk. Hopefully this is enough size that you can see this. So it starts with inventorying your assets, your data assets, your systems, and so forth, and particularly your crown jewel assets. Like, what are the systems and data without which your business absolutely would stop running if it fell over, or your organization. And it doesn't matter where these are located. It could be on-prem, it could be cloud, it could be hybrid, could be SaaS services. And some of these software as a service or application as a service, things like Salesforce and so forth, that has broken down now to things like microservices, where an application is broken out into dozens and dozens of individual functions, and each function can operate on an elastic basis with hundreds, depending on the size of your business, of instances operating in the cloud and within a containerized environment. So all of a sudden, your applications are spread out across literally thousands of systems. And you can even purchase function as a service now. For example, AWS Lambda is function as a service. And there are certain things like messaging that are pretty much the same, no matter what type of environment you're in, that you can now just buy as a function to help build your application. So all that makes the attack surface much broader than it was 5 years ago even. And so you have to really identify where your systems are. And the reason is simple. You can't manage what you can't measure. If you don't know where your data are, how are you going to protect it? So that's a key and pretty fundamental IT basic blocking and tackling that's critical to cybersecurity. So let's encrypt the data, right? That's everybody knows, the little lock icon in your browser means that the session is encrypted, but there are many different types of encryption. It's not just on a browser. It's while that data is at rest, in other words, in storage and not being used, in transit over the network. And finally, while it's in use. So most of us aren't aware of this, but for example, Google and the other cloud providers use something called homomorphic encryption now. I apologize for these, if you're able to see these messages. Homomorphic encryption encrypts data while it's actually in use, which is more secure, because some of the recent types of well, not just recent, in the last number of years, we've got malware that sits in memory, not just on the disk. And so it can be very transient and hard to detect in memory, which is what started some of the endpoint companies to do process detection, not just scanning of file hashes and signatures. And of course, a key requirement here is also how you manage certificates and access to those encryption keys, which requires something called an HSM. So moving along here, and let me just check how I'm doing on timing. We're getting there. UTM Firewall. Most people have some kind of firewall already. So I think in general, this is probably where, from a technology point of view, most organizations are already covered. UTM means Unified Threat Management. It's a very interesting thing, because about 10 years ago, a firewall was one device. There was another device called Intrusion Detection and Prevention, or IDPS, or IPS for short. Web gateways, proxies, malware inspection, antivirus signature and scanning, and on and on. UTM, those were all separate pieces of equipment 10 years ago. And you had to, probably each one would cost, anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000. And you'd have to stick them in your data center or headquarters building, and it was super expensive. So very few companies can afford to do that. Now, with miniaturized components and increase in the processing, motherboard processing available on small form factors, the firewall and security industry has consolidated, and all those separate functions are now available on this UTM firewall. And you can have a very small form factor and inexpensive device. And that's where kind of a lot of the industry is going in general. And that's a good thing in terms of defense in depth. But this is a basic blocking and tackling. And of course, it's not just having the device. You have to customize the rules and policies that are implemented in that device to protect your environment. And these firewalls can be implemented in the cloud. They can be implemented on-prem on a virtual machine, or typically for performance, we like to use hardware if possible, because there are dedicated ASICs used for things like file decryption, and it's much more performant. But with cloud elasticity, that gate has probably gone away as well. So next, endpoint and antivirus, of course. Everybody knows what antivirus was. If you remember from 5 years ago, sitting there, well, your Norton or Symantec would scan your computer. And what it would essentially do back then is there's our libraries of malware, right? And each type of malware is an executable or a DLL on Windows, or some kind of file that is a binary file. And each file can have a hash, which is like an MD5 hash is essentially a fingerprint for the million ones and zeros in that file on disk. And these antivirus companies would use that signature to scan and see if it was present on your disk. Well, that is really, really dated technology now. It's still necessary. You still got to kind of put up with it and do it. But the signature files can't keep up with the malware. They're these polymorphic malware is a type of malware that's able to change itself dynamically on the fly every time it runs if it wants to. And that means every time it runs, it's got a different file hash and a different signature that your antivirus may not be able to detect. Again, one of the reasons why next generation endpoints products now include things like process monitoring and heuristic behavioral analysis and other types of much more advanced techniques than signature scanning. Virtual execution sandbox, where you'll take an unknown type of file, you'll throw it in a virtualized environment that's not your actual, not a real user machine, for Windows, for Linux, for different versions of Windows, and they'll execute it and detonate it and see if it does anything malicious behavior. And this is a great technique that, actually many of the UTM firewall companies use, and now many of the endpoint companies use that as well. And that detonation is usually done in the cloud. But you need a next generation endpoint company. So if you're still using file scanning only, if you're still using an older licensed model of antivirus, go explore a new type of endpoint protection. Definitely worth some type of investment. Segment networks. So this is where it starts to get a little more technical and a little more difficult to implement. So many mid-sized companies I talk to have a flat network, which means the same IP address range. So if an attacker gets in on one machine and is able to escalate their privileges to admin, let's say they compromise an admin system, then they can get to any other system on the network. Segmentation prevents that from happening. Coupled with network access controls that require you to authenticate or sign in to those other network segments based on least privilege. So if one part of your environment, let's say your front office, gets hacked, and the back office database where all your customer data is stored, or your financial transaction processing is stored, the hacker won't necessarily be able, or it'll be much more difficult to get through the door into that backend database, which is your crown jewels. So segmenting networks is not easy to do, but there are established processes for doing it, and you get help in doing that. And you want to make sure your management ports on your devices, servers, whether virtualized or real, are not available publicly, which is sort of a key backdoor. Like one of the most common things I see is like a database, right? So which has crown jewel data. This was a healthcare company I helped out a number of years ago, and they have their their vendor for that database needed to come in and do some maintenance. So they had opened up a port and a protocol to allow that vendor in for remote maintenance of the database. And as typical, and that was on their firewall, they opened up the port and protocol, and somebody forgot to remove the policy, after the day or two that the vendor needed to be on the system, and it was left open. And that's a very common type of, human error that occurs all the time. So a lot of this just isn't technical vulnerabilities. It's just plain old configuration mistakes and human error. When I said 80-20, remember 80% of this is people, and people make mistakes. Scan and patch. So this is a pretty common, well-known one, but easier said than done. So you can look every day, and the National Vulnerability Database, which is managed by the Department of Homeland Security, and actually by Carnegie Mellon on the back end for Homeland Security, maintains a list of all publicly known vulnerabilities in software and hardware. And these are called CVEs, common vulnerabilities. And you need to scan for those on your system, because it's just like Windows Update on your PC. You got to patch it and make sure that it's not vulnerable, or somebody's going to come in and find it and eventually exploit it. And you're making the hacker's job really easy by not patching your systems. That being said, if you're a bank or a trading company and you're running, $10 million a day in revenue through a server, I don't really want to take that offline necessarily, and I have to plan it very carefully in order to patch and reboot it if it requires that. Some patches don't require rebooting, of course, but that requires an HA infrastructure on that application server, where you can flip from a primary to secondary, or active to passive on the network as well. And so it's complicated. And some companies want to test those patches to make sure they're not going to interfere with older applications, in particular things like mainframe applications, which many companies still use. But next, we want to monitor user behavior in directory services. So as we've seen in the last year with things like the SolarWinds supply chain attack, directory services like Active Directory are a very vulnerable vector. There's even Microsoft announced a new vulnerability in their directory services. I think it was this week or last. That's another fairly major one. But there are things we can do to make this less risky. So monitoring access, user behavior across the network, especially for privileged users who have admin rights on systems. Implement MFA, multi-factor authentication, right? So there are even some very easy, MFA is two-factor, right? Don't use cell phones, right? It's very easy with SIM card swapping to pretend you're a user and receive their two-factor text messages. You want to use ideally a hardware or software device. And some of these are very user-friendly, where they actually can replace passwords, like Microsoft Authenticator has a very simple and user-friendly system for doing that. HSMs, hardware service modules. That basically, it's a fancy term for a secure enclave or storage place for your certificates, right? So for a machine-to-machine, server-to-server communications, that you can't obviously have somebody logging in every time an API call is made. You have to do that using certificates to do it securely. And an HSM is really the only secure way to store those certificates. And there's some really cool HSM technology that take a key and they split the key across a pair of HSMs, which makes it even harder to break into. Monitor those directory services and identify unusual behavior, like admins logging into systems over which they have no business logging in, for example. Allowed applications. This is easier said than done. But in general, you should know what applications your employees and staff are allowed to use, right? And you want to make sure that those are enabled, of course, that they will be enabled on your firewall across your networks and on your servers, but make sure they don't compromise. Scan them, assess third-party risk with the vendors, and that's a whole nother program that most businesses can't afford to do. And then the opposite of allowed applications, and by the way, these are all, most of these, I've kind of customized this, but most of this is based on this NIST cybersecurity framework. So these are well-established practices, and you can learn about them by going online and Googling that NIST 8374. Shadow IT. So many of our employees, especially in work from home, okay, I'm in the middle of the day working. I got to log into my Google account to check email. I've got to log into, my personal Dropbox to check whatever. It's hard to avoid, but it is a high risk, because all of a sudden, you have no guarantee that your employees, your staff, your contractors are practicing good security on their own personal home devices, home networks, or applications. And there are tools to monitor this and even block it if you so choose. Access to shadow IT. There's a category of services called Cloud Access Security Brokers, or CASBs. And even some of the SaaS services like Box.com have their own Box Protect method for preventing customers from misusing their privileges and rights to corporate data on those, like sending it out to somebody outside the company, for example, or downloading and 20 gig of corporate data on 5 o'clock on a Saturday, which is, there's no, and sending it to China, just to give an extreme example. Least privilege, another important principle. I'm almost at time here, but I'm almost done. Standard user accounts versus admin privileges. Many of us give our employees, staff, and contractors admin privileges on their computers, where they allow them to install anything and so forth. So the least amount of privilege possible, and implement policy and access reviews with management. Credential authorization. So again, we talked about credentials and HSMs before, but you've got to rotate passwords and credentials periodically and make sure people still need access to systems, right? One of the common mistakes here is that I hired a contractor to manage my database or some key crown jewel server, and that contractor no longer works at the company, but the credentials are still valid, right? So this is where you got to work with HR and be notified when people leave the company, and make sure you have systems. Again, there are systems for automating this, but it all starts to add up. And then finally, just training your users, right? Don't open files from unknown sources. Try and evaluate the links in your emails. Make sure you're inspecting them carefully if they come from external versus internal users. Check domain names. It's kind of a pain, especially if you're in a meeting and you're trying to quote unquote multitask. It's really easy to make mistakes, and this kind of training is mandatory, and it's not expensive to do. So that's the list of basic practices that everybody starts to need or needs to start thinking about. And of course, there's a maturity scale. You don't have to do this all at once, but we all should aspire to doing most of it. And finally, so that was all the protect side, and protect and prevent. If you think of that NIST framework, right? We want to detect things before they become a security breach. But if you do get breached, and remember, 3 out of 4 companies are likely to suffer a ransomware attack in the next 2 or 3 years, what do we do to respond and recover? And this is equally important in achieving that maturity, right? Test your data backups, test your restores, have and implement a detailed plan for this. I can't emphasize this enough. I have a good friend of mine who runs a small insurance company, and he got hit with a ransomware attack. And because he had a good backup plan in place, he was able to tell the attackers to go stuff it. Because he just restored his data. He may have lost a couple hours of work, but that's better than being offline. One example where I was participating in an incident response cleanup exercise for an insurance company in the Midwest, mid-sized company. They had to take all their systems down. The only way they could write insurance policies for about 2 weeks' time was via facsimile, which, needless to say, reduced the volume of their revenue dramatically during that period. And it was a bit of a nightmare, and we helped them get back up. But you got to have a data backup and restoration strategy. And you have to make sure those backups are isolated, right? They can't be on the same network that the attackers are landed on. Immutable storage, somewhat a little harder to practice, but a good policy, again, recommended by, it was either NIST or Gartner. Basically, don't allow your employees and admins to overwrite those data backups, right? Because if an attacker steals admin credentials and they have they're able to access that, using immutable storage prevents the data from being damaged, which reduces the efficacy or effectiveness of the ransomware attack. And then scan those repositories for malware. You don't want to restore from a repository if that was a backup taken before the incident. And practice your incident recovery plan. You've got to have contact list in place, offline contact lists, or in a different storage, because you may not be able to access it in the ransomware attack, including law enforcement and your decision tree. And I can't emphasize this enough. Get a retainer in place with a firm qualified to perform forensic analysis and incident response. All right. Because if you get hit, when we get hit with a ransomware attack, one of the biggest challenges is that you may think you've cleaned up the systems affected, but there may be other systems infected. And the attackers have a footprint there, and they're just waiting to come back and do it again in 2 weeks, 2 months, or 2 years. And this is a really common thing. So the residual footprint, not just the visibly affected ones, but cleaning up all systems. And then finally, in that continuous learning cycle, close the gap to get better and improve continuously. Actually, we're not going to go to QA. I'm going to ask Eric now to chime in and give you his perspective on some of the cutting edge technology that he's involved in and best practices. Eric, over to you.
So I just unmuted and took myself off video, so hopefully you can see me. So you'll catch on very quickly that Ivan went to MIT and I went to a liberal arts college. So hopefully it'll be a good compliment to a lot of what Ivan said. So I do have some slides, although I've been having some challenges this morning pulling them up. So rather than waste a few more minutes trying to do that, I'll probably just talk through a few things. So first of all, we've talked a lot about ransomware. And the question that I think about a lot and I hear a lot is, why is that such a problem now? Why is that such a new thing? Clearly, the internet's not new. Clearly, security is not a new issue. Clearly, opportunistic and greedy threat actors are not new. And so why is ransomware such a significant problem now? And I think there's a few answers for that I'll touch on first, then I'll go to a couple other areas. First is the bad guys are simply getting better. And if you look at the democratization of the tools, technologies, capabilities to commit those attacks and to execute those attacks, those things are more available than ever. And the bad guys collaborate in sharing those tools, sharing those techniques, sharing what's worked. And also there's a democratization on the monetization of those attacks, whether it's Bitcoin, blockchain, or just more basic collaboration behind the scenes in terms of how to monetize the attacks and monetize the data and what it is that's been stolen or compromised. And so the second part, when we talk about the capabilities, we talk about AI, machine learning, automation, deep fakes, all these things that may not seem relevant to a lot of organizations or enterprises, especially small and medium-sized businesses. Well, they may not be relevant to a lot of organizations, even at this point in their trajectory, but they're very relevant to the bad guys. And the bad guys understand how to create those unique and novel and opportunistic attacks. And they share that information and they execute on that information very effectively. And then the other part of it is when you talk about some of the more sophisticated attackers, they do get support, either material or political, from nation state actors, from countries who are pursuing those objectives. So the bad guys have simply gotten better. On the flip side of it, targets have gotten much harder to defend. They've gotten much more diverse. And so when we talk about digital transformation, when we talk from work from home, when we talk about all these things that have been sort of the natural trend within the marketplace, but then also accelerated and exacerbated by COVID, all that's happened is it has become more complex and more sophisticated to protect yourself as a target. And the other part of that is a lot of targets don't even know or understand why they're targets. And we refer to that as essentially sort of data rich and security poor, which basically means, we as organizations have a lot of critical data, we have a lot of critical assets, we have a lot of critical information, we have a lot of critical things of value to the bad guys. We may not even understand or appreciate why that would be of value to a bad guy, let alone having the resources or the investments to make in securing those assets. And so you have this dynamic where oftentimes very rich and plentiful targets don't understand that what they have of value and why they're of interest. And at the same time, they don't have the knowledge, the expertise, or the money to effectively protect themselves. The third thing is there's really no credible deterrent. Why is it not in the interest of the bad guys or the threat actors to take advantage of opportunities in ransomware when there's really no credible deterrent or credible punishment for them? Yes, anecdotally, we'll see once in a while that some Russian guy's bank account has been frozen, or the FBI has issued some arrest warrant for somebody in Romania. But those things are few and far between. They're very difficult to enforce. Last time I checked, we haven't invaded anybody or declared war on anybody or launched missiles at anybody or done anything that really can drive a really stern deterrent. That's not to say there aren't things being contemplated. That's not to say there aren't isolated incidents where somebody really has suffered consequences. But the simple reality is, from the threat actor side, there's no sense or there's no perceived reality where there's a threat to them or there's a deterrent to them to not conduct those attacks. And the next point is really simple, which is it pays. Cybercrime pays. Ransomware pays, and it pays very efficiently. And the reality is, with the insurance, cyber insurance industry being what it is, it's now even easier to pay than it ever has been before. So there are some discussions around what type of reform or new approaches would be needed in cyber insurance, because it's like going back to old hostage negotiation. The U.S. does not negotiate, does not pay for hostages. Well, that actually is effective at a certain point. And when we have a system in place where cyber insurance, among other dynamics in the marketplace, enable the payment so efficiently and so readily, I don't know about you guys. I don't often see news reports of banks being robbed very often anymore. And I'm sure there's a lot of reasons for that. And I sort of say that tongue in cheek. But what we talk a lot about at Blue Vector, and so Blue Vector is actually a part of Comcast. So what we talk a lot about at Blue Vector and at Comcast is how do we create a world where cybercrime is so inefficient and so ineffective that it just doesn't pay? And the corollary to that is the way that we think about how we engage with folks that we work with is, there's no such thing as a silver bullet. There's no such thing as 100% protection. And if any group with any level of sophistication is going to target you, you're going to be compromised. And so that's where you see trends in the market now that talk about, and Ivan talked a lot about this. Well, let's assume somebody gets into the network. How do we then mitigate the impact and mitigate the damage that they can do? And so, when you work under that assumption, what you're really also talking about is efficiency and inefficiency. And so if we assume that you really can't ever honestly protect your organization 100%, but you can really make it pretty inefficient for people to target you and to compromise you. So before you even get to the point of, I'm going to pay, I'm not going to pay, and what else am I doing here? The fact is, they're not looking at you individually in most cases, in 99.9% of cases. They're scanning the marketplace, they're scanning the networks for vulnerability and efficiency. And if you can just make yourself and your organization that much more, that much less efficient than other people, then, they really are going to move on to other targets. So we talk a lot about how do you drive efficient, inefficiency for the attackers. And one of the things that we think a lot about in terms of sort of the mission in cybersecurity and how we think about what it means to protect our networks and our assets, and that is consequences. And I think for the longest time in cybersecurity, the reality of consequences is they've been much more theoretical. They've been much more, hypothetical, conceptual, whatever the right word is. When you want to talk about things like, data privacy and data integrity and public trust and shareholder value and all these things that to the average person, even employees within large enterprises, let alone in SMBs, let alone to consumers, yeah, I get it. It sounds important, but I don't really understand. I don't really sort of viscerally feel the impact or the consequences of that. Well, the fact is we're living in a different world right now. We're living in a world right now where ransomware and other attacks are targeting food production. They're targeting hospitals. They're targeting drug trials. They're targeting police departments. They're targeting schools. And so when we live in a world where my 8-year-old daughter knows what ransomware is and knows what the Colonial Pipeline is, because in Virginia, we had to sit in line for an hour to get gas, that tells you we're living in a different world now with a different set of consequences. When the DC Metropolitan Police Department had refused to pay and all of their files containing informant information was released, and there are stories, anecdotal albeit, about people being tracked down on the streets who've been working with the police, that's no longer theoretical or conceptual. Those are real world implications. When you have systems being held hostage in hospitals and people dying in hospitals because they can't get the treatment or the ventilator's not working or, whatever it is, those are real world consequences that move beyond sort of the theoretical that has often been the case within cybersecurity. And when we talk about all the things that we need to do to protect our organizations, when we walk through all the, the details that I've been walked through about, what do those things mean? Why are they important? And the reality is, I would suggest those things are more important than they've ever been because the consequences have never been more significant and have never been greater. One of the things that Ivan talked about is understanding your assets and what are the crown jewels. And so whether you're a small business, whether you're a large enterprise, there are certain things within your organization that are so fundamental and so critical to the well-being of your business, to the well-being of you as a business owner, or you as an employee, or your customers or your shareholders, understanding what those assets are is critical to understanding how they need to be defended and the right tools, technologies, and processes that allow you to defend them. But there's a flip side to that also, if we think about that from the perspective of the adversaries. And like I said, oftentimes we as organizations, we don't even really understand what it is that is of value to somebody who's looking to compromise us or to attack us or steal from us. And the reality is that's a problem that permeates all the way up to the US government and how our government agencies and government departments think about these things. So we in the US, we think a lot about cybersecurity as something unique, as something in its own domain, in its own silo. But the reality is we have to understand how our adversaries think about that. And so, okay, it's easy to understand that adversaries, criminal gangs and criminal elements, their motivation is financial, their motivation is monetary. Well, that informs how we can think about our defense. But while most of us will never necessarily be exposed to nation state actors, except within very large enterprises, the reality is if you look at the Chinese, you look at the Russians, you look at others, they support or at least give safe harbor to the criminal gangs because they're acting on their behalf, even though that one group, that one gang, that one function may be sort of micro scale in nature, it's serving the interest of a broader purpose. And so when we think about what that broader purpose is, it's important to understand from a broader perspective. And I know this can sound crazy sitting here in Comcast or sitting here in an SMB or, thinking about these global things, but the reality is they impact how we have to think about security. And so the fact is we hear a lot about the Russians. Well, the fact is the Russians don't care about cybersecurity. The Russians don't care about ransomware. The Russians don't care about cyber attacks. What the Russians care about is influence, political influence, economic influence. And that's the lens through which they think about things. If we think about all the talk about, Chinese hackers, Chinese ransomware, Chinese theft of IP, again, the Chinese think about it differently than we do. They don't care about cybersecurity. They care about economic growth and prosperity. They care about the economic health and stability of their country. And so when they don't think about cybersecurity, they think about the economic benefit of a particular activity, and cyber being one of the tools they use to try and secure or ensure that economic benefit they're looking for. And the North Koreans, just as a last example, we hear about the North Korean hack of Sony and of other, I'm forgetting them off the top of my head, but other well-publicized attacks by the North Koreans. The North Koreans don't care about Sony. The North Koreans don't care about cybersecurity. What the North Koreans care about is regime stability and maintaining their control over a fragile system, a fragile country, and deterring the US from launching missiles at them. So one of the challenges I think that we have in thinking about cybersecurity and cyber defense is we don't think critically enough about who's attacking us and why they're attacking us and what that means or what that implies about how we think about our defense. And maybe a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I would have felt a little bit foolish, having this conversation in a setting where, maybe we're thinking about more SMBs, maybe we're thinking about more sort of localized enterprises and organizations. But the simple fact is we don't have that luxury anymore because that's not how our adversaries see it. That's not how the criminal gangs see it. And so those of us who maybe at one point in time, because of the nature of our organization, felt that it wasn't our problem, it wasn't our issue, those days are over. And those days are over as you better understand the driving motivation of those who are trying to attack and compromise our organizations. Ivan, I saw you went off mute. You have something to say?
Yeah, because I've seen a couple of trends lately that, 5 years ago, we probably thought most of us weren't subject to nation state actors. And I've actually seen a number of nation state attacks against pretty small businesses that were involved in the defense and defense contractor supply chain. And because they present backdoor opportunities to get into larger companies. And so really, I think we're sadly at a situation where everybody's at risk. Last year in 2020, we saw the first actual documented person death from a cyber attack and ransomware, which was in a hospital in Germany, sadly. And so this is very real. Colonial Pipeline certainly made it real for us here at home in the United States, but everybody's at risk. And, how can a small business hope to compete when even the largest companies? Well, the answer is there's help available. There are established service providers. I'm not pitching Comcast here in any way. There are hundreds of them that can help you with incident response and disaster recovery, that can help you implement best practices, almost like an outsourced CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer, for everything from compromise assessment, risk assessment, all the way up to monitoring your environment 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year long. So reach out for help, but you will have to make some kind of investment to do that. You don't have to do it all yourself, though, and we have to, as an industry, cybersecurity industry and professionals, we have to effectively democratize cybersecurity to make it more affordable and less complex for mid-sized small businesses to consume, because they are a huge target today. And this is where we have some societal choices to make. You talked about the role of government before, Eric. I look at this, not to get too conceptual and theoretical here, but the great dialectic of our time, it used to be communism, capitalism. The great dialectic of our time is privacy and security. And the government was actually able to go in after the Colonial Pipeline and seize the servers and seize the actual cryptocurrency Bitcoin that the company used to pay the hackers and return it to Colonial Pipeline. And those are consequences on the other side. So disrupting the financial network, which ultimately was fundamental to how, back in 9/11, we ended up being able to disrupt terrorist networks substantially. We need to do the same thing over time. And this is my personal opinion, not a Comcast opinion, for cybersecurity, cyber criminals. Anyway, back to you, Eric. Sorry for that diversion.
Hold on, I'm Googling what dialectic means. Hold on a second.
I deserve that.
So I know I'm running out of time, so let me just sort of speed through two more things very quickly. And I will just say, Ivan raised a fabulous point that I should not have overlooked, which is, even as a small and medium-sized business, even down to sole single practitioners, the flow down of security requirements from customers, from prime contract partners, whether it's the government or industry, whether it's the Comcast supply chain or other enterprise supply chains, which flow down to all these SMBs. If you haven't already, you will see requirements flowing down as part of the contracts that you have to maintain and abide by certain security standards. The Department of Defense is going to that. Comcast is going to that. Every large enterprise we work with is going to that. And so they are expecting that supply chain down to the mom and pop shops to maintain that certain level of protection and preparedness and readiness. And that's something that is going to, if it's not already, it's going to affect everybody contractually who does business with any other organization, especially who is in the supply chain as far down, even as far down as you can get, with these large organizations. And that's a great point.
That is a great point. I mean, I've seen a couple of cases recently, which is a brand new trend, where even for unregulated businesses, Typically it was healthcare and financial services and critical infrastructure like energy that would be most heavily regulated and have to implement security controls. Now we're seeing non-regulated companies, their auditors are coming in and saying, you don't have enough resources, that's a risk. You need to go out and hire a managed security service provider or managed detection and response provider to monitor your environment 24/7. So that, I think, Eric, you're absolutely right. That is coming for every SMB and mid-market company who needs to do business now.
So I know I'm short on time, so I'll just give a shameless plug maybe for another conversation. I was going to rant and rave even more about both social engineering and AI machine learning, as Ivan touched on, something that just permeates everything we're doing, not just within Blue Vector, but even more broadly within strategic development at Comcast, and that is robotic process automation and intelligent process automation, which at the end of the day, when we think about how we use AI machine learning within Blue Vector, it's really just a lot of words to describe intelligent process automation for security operations centers and others. And I just think the potential and the opportunity in that market, not just as it relates to security, but more generally, just has incredible and profound implications. And then, social engineering, as somebody once said to me, sort of crassly, you can't code dumb and vulnerable out of the system. And so the only thing I'll say on this is, we talk about all these attacks and people talk about the sophistication of these attacks. And I'm not saying in every case, but I would suggest in a lot of cases, it's sort of cascading degrees of sophistication, where if you talk about the attack sort of at scale, yeah, like I can't even understand it. It's amazingly complex and sophisticated. But then as you sort of deconstruct it, you realize, oh, well, they got in and this all started because dummy used 1, 2, 3, 4 as a password, right? I mean, and so, and a lot of that, or, so-and-so, received an ad on Facebook for a new dating app, and they clicked on it and shared their credentials. So like I said, as somebody once correctly said, you can't code dumb and vulnerable out of the system. And the bad guys are really, really good and proficient at exploiting human vulnerability, to achieve just those ends. And like I said, I have a lot more to say on that, but I'll pause there and turn it over.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Eric. Thanks,
I'll
Al.
jump in here really quick, if you guys don't mind, because we did actually get a question. So the question was, there are over millions of unfilled cybersecurity jobs worldwide. How can we hope to fight the hackers when it's so difficult to hire skilled people?
Eric, you want to take that first, or you want to?
Sure, yeah, I'll jump in. So, I mean, you really do touch on, really sort of one of the central challenges. And so let me sort of just flip that around for a second and just talk about how we think about addressing it. And I don't mean how we think about addressing it within Blue Vector or Comcast, but how we think about sort of our obligation and sort of our public service. So sort of killing two birds with one stone. We've always taken very seriously the opportunity and our responsibility to engage with at-risk, diverse, less traditional communities, populations, schools, and others, to provide support in any number of ways. Even transitioning veterans is a big cause for us. And so we do focus very heavily on the sorts of career transition and training programs and opportunities we can provide to folks. Now, we happen to focus on sort of less traditional, sort of more at-risk, disadvantaged communities and populations and schools. And I don't mean that just in terms of race, ethnicity, but also sort of economically disadvantaged. We do some programs in West Virginia, as an example. And I don't mean to paint West Virginia with a broad brush, but just places in West Virginia with maybe less traditional access to some of this type of training and opportunities. And we do that because there is that shortage. We do that because it is the right thing to do. And we do that because we, at the end of the day, do believe it'll serve Blue Vector and Comcast well.
Yeah, I think You touched on this before, automation, machine learning, and so forth. Now, it's a war game, right? Every time we make an advance on the defense and defend side on automation, the attackers and bad guys do the same thing, and they're leveraging the same tools. And so, without going into details, but that we need to keep up in that, and we need to keep investing in automation. Security event management is a kind of a legacy traditional way of looking at security events and having an analyst determine whether they're important, and is this a security breach? Is it a security event that's going to lead to a data breach? How serious is it? And a number of years ago, typically in a large company, an analyst would have to look at thousands of events a day. Home Depot data breach is a great example. The post-incident, and this was maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago, Home Depot, their point of sales terminals were breached and all the credit card data was stolen for some period of time. It turned out after the post-incident analysis that there were actually about 60,000 security events that could have led somebody to detect them. But we're dealing with information overload now, right? So no human, no matter how good they are, can look at thousands of events today and not go cross-eyed and not miss something. So now the latest technologies for security analytics have it down to where an analyst only has to look at like 100 a day, and they've already filtered out only anything that's not important or potential false positive with a very high degree of accuracy. So things like that helping dramatically. The second thing in terms of hiring resources is what I said before. You need to go out and partner to get help. You need to make an investment in like hiring an incident response retainer in case you do get breached. A managed security service provider who is trained, has playbooks, has done this for years to monitor your environment 24/7 and call you if there's a serious problem, so that you can focus on doing what your business does best and not try and be a cybersecurity expert. And that industry is growing by leaps and bounds as well. MDR, managed detection and response. It used to be that these types of services would detect something and call you up and say, hey, you better go patch that system or fix this or that. And then, I've got 500 other things to do running my business today. How serious is this? Well, difficult to know. Now, the industry has evolved to, we're not only monitoring security events, we're helping companies fix them proactively. And that's the response side of it. So go out and get help, spend a little bit of time, and you'll see a big return on investment, and grow your maturity to the point where, as Eric alerted to before, we're going to make it difficult enough that an attacker, organized crime, even nation states will go to more opportunistic and more vulnerable targets, because we want to make it difficult enough for them to avoid coming to us first.
Perfect. And we have another question that's a little bit of a follow-up from that. So it's from Ida Birdhill, and they founded Automation Works, which is a cybersecurity certification post-secondary school here in Detroit. So they train and place learners in other states, and they're looking for advice on how to get Michigan employers to hire diverse cybersecurity trained professionals. So I know it's a little specific to Michigan, but is there any advice or words that either of you two think would be able to help?
Well, I mean, there are, first of all, there are countless studies now out that really emphasize the importance of diversity solving problems, diversity and inclusion, right? So the legacy top-down model of, I am the CEO and I am the manager and you shall do as I tell you to do, that's out. That doesn't work. I roll up my sleeves and get in the trenches every day. And I have fun doing it. And that's the new model for the world, right? The same is absolutely true in cybersecurity. By just one example, my boss is a Native American woman, and that's pretty unusual in cybersecurity, but Comcast is really cutting edge in this. I think you need to partner to get the message out on cybersecurity education and training, as I mentioned before, is a key linchpin, because as Eric said, you can't fix dumb, but you can train people not to be so dumb and make mistakes. We all make mistakes. I make like a bunch of them every day, but you got to learn from them, continuously improve. And my recommendation to you is go partner with some cyber companies, because again, a complete model without training is not complete. You'll never achieve maturity. And training is probably one of the easiest things you can do with your staff, your contractors, your employees.
I would just add on one thing, and obviously I'm in no position to comment specifically on Michigan. But what I will tell you very practically, and again, the only shameless plug I'll give for Comcast in this whole thing is they do a very good job on the DE&I initiatives. And I know as a manager, I really, not only do I believe in trying to make strides there, but I'm actually sort of evaluated and measured on that. And what I often find is, even in a company the size of Comcast, those opportunities to engage with, folks who've been newly trained, more diverse populace, those don't find me. Nobody's emailing me and calling me at Comcast and saying, hey, we have this opportunity to partner. Hey, I get a bunch of nonsense on LinkedIn, but I really don't get any direct outreach to me. And so I have to go out and find those things proactively. And so when it comes to, training folks and placing those folks, whether, it's, as part of diversity initiatives or not, or career transition or educational transition opportunities, whatever they may be, those are tremendous opportunities for us in a variety of ways. But oftentimes, I, in my role, I just don't know about them. And so it's not that we're not receptive, or I imagine folks in Michigan aren't receptive, but getting connected with those opportunities isn't as easy as it sounds, even for large companies. And so just doing whatever you need to do to get in front of them and communicate with them. And I know, if I got emails saying, hey, we're doing this training program, we have these opportunities. Yeah, honestly, that would not be a nuisance. That would make my life and how I'm evaluated, frankly, easier.
Yeah, so that speaks a little bit to just the factor of awareness. What training programs are there? What products are available? Things like that. So great answer. If anybody has any more questions, we do have a little bit more time. I have one that I think will just be helpful for everybody. So if someone's joining this webinar, whether they're a CEO, manager, or employee, this can get, I think, pretty complicated if you dive into it. What's the starting point for somebody? How do they get this implemented? What's like the first step they can do within their company to just get on top of things and start making this journey to be more secure?
You really need to do two things to start with. One, as I mentioned before, you need to understand your assets. Where is your data? Where does it live? What systems it is on? And because again, if you don't know where your crown jewels are, you can't protect it. And that sounds surprisingly simple, but it sounds simple, but it's surprisingly difficult to do for many companies, especially now that we're all using cloud services like Microsoft 365 and Google Drive and Box and so forth. It becomes very diverse. So take an inventory. The second thing is do an assessment. Go out and get some help if you need to, but do an assessment of where you are on cybersecurity and sort of the growth, the path to maturity. Both in terms of technology, but also really importantly, people, process. And that's where the training, by the way, comes in, obviously, because that's a gap for any size organization. So yeah, assets, take an inventory, And then do an assessment of where your greatest risks are and where you need to start first. Because as I said before, every organization is different. Every company, every business, if you're a nonprofit, it's going to be very difficult or different than whether you're commercial, if you're in banking versus healthcare versus you're a law firm. Everybody varies very, very widely. Eric, any?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that other than to say, the biggest opportunity is also the biggest challenge, which is, as Ivan has said, there's so many people now who can basically help or do that first step for you. Okay, well, that's the opportunity. The challenge is there's so many of them. My recommendation would be get a recommendation. Talk to people who are in a similar place, whether if you're starting a new business, if you think about the size, the complexion of your business, talk to your friends, talk to your vendors, talk to your partners, and I understand, you probably don't want to be advertising, any security issues you have. I understand that, but just ask for recommendations, same as you would for a builder or a painter or a physical therapist, because the problem won't be finding somebody to help you. The problem will be finding somebody good and reliable to help you. But again, the opportunity is there's so many folks who sort of out of the box can provide so much support and a great starting point for you.
But one of the two specific recommendations that are regionally focused in every state and area of the country are there's these things called ISACs, Industry Sector Advisory Committees. And there is ISACA, which is a regionally focused organization with an emphasis on cybersecurity. Go to a local chapter meeting. You will meet other people in the same boat as you. And then also one of my personal favorites is the InfraGard program, GARD, which is a public-private partnership created by the FBI. And there are chapters all over the country. That insurance company I helped out a few years ago in the Midwest, I actually met them at an InfraGard meeting. And, that guy found me as a resource, my company at the time, and we helped mitigate an event for him. And then in that continuous improvement model, we helped them make sure it didn't happen again. So join your local InfraGard. Really, almost anybody can join. You do have to get approved, but it's not a difficult process, and there's a wealth of resources that you can find through that, as well as personal contacts.
Perfect. Thank you both so much. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to reach out to me or Automation Alley. We'll also send out information so you can ask Ivan or Eric. I know we're running low on time, but I believe Chauncey is going to join us to.
So yes, for all attendees here today, we are going to do a raffle for a smart TV. Thank you again for joining, and let's see who our big winner is going to be. Congratulations, SW. I will reach out to you via email to get your shipping information. Back over to you, Allison.
Perfect. Well, thank you for that. And thank you so much, Ivan and Eric, for joining today and just sharing your thought leadership and expertise with us. Like I said, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to email Automation Alley. We'll get their information out as well. Don't forget, this is recorded and it will be on our Automation Alley website. So we'll follow up with everybody that watched today and send you the recording. You can also access it. So there's been a lot of great information. Please share it with anybody that you think would find this pertaining to you. And again, if you look on the screen, there is information for Todd England. He will be able to give you any questions on security products. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday. Thank you, Ivan and Eric.
Thanks, Allison.
Mm-hmm.